the feminist movement over the last several decades, or the idea of sexism in the workplace and the church, and I mean, you name it, it's been talked about, has become a very popular discussion. And that term sexism is just defined as a prejudice or stereotyping or discrimination. It's typically done against women on the basis of sex. And we talk about God, we talk about the church, and that term sexist has now started to make its way into discussions. And people are starting to basically accuse the Bible, God, church, the home, whatever, as being sexist. And those are real problems that I guarantee you when I was 5, I never thought I'd have to worry about. Sure. Even when I entered into ministry, just a little over 6-7 years ago when I started preaching school and was preaching, part-time down the road in Mississippi, I didn't think that this would become such a big topic. And yet, especially over the last 5 to 7 years, it has really, ballooned into a major discussion point. And so when someone comes up and says, God is sexist, I think that that's such an abrasive statement that we are right to be taken aback by it. But it is a legitimate statement that has been made. I mean, if you were to type that onto the internet, I guarantee you're going to find dozens of articles, basically championing that same mindset. So what would you do if someone says, God's sexist, right? How would you answer that?
And I think you're right. I think it's okay to have the discussion, but what I typically do when I get hit with a question like that,
right,
because it is a little abrasive, and I'm usually taken aback by something like that, I want to know, well, why do you think that God is sexist? I'm going to throw the question back at them,
right,
and try to see where they're coming from. If it's from a, modern day feminist point of view, and those who are trying to promote antagonism toward God and toward the God of the Bible and toward the Bible itself and those topics surrounding religion, because that's typically what they're trying to tear down. It's coming from several different fronts, but you're right. And I did kind of Google it to kind of, where is this going?
Right.
This kind of question that comes up about, is God sexist? And if it's the case that he is, that would be problematic.
Right.
Nobody wants to serve a God that is a respecter of persons in that way. And so we'll keep that term in the back of our mind for just a moment. But again, I want to know, where is this person coming from? What is the background of their reasoning? Because there usually is some kind of reason for that kind of thing. And I think it is even politically charged, obviously, in society right now, as well as maybe many other things when it comes to the Bible. But culturally, I think, many people are right. Yes, society has denigrated women in many ways. But God and His Son and the Spirit, their work has elevated women. And I would hope that the individual who asked that type of question would give us opportunity to kind of to go and to see some of those things. But what I find interesting is the wise man Solomon, when writing the Proverbs, especially in Proverbs 1 and verse 20 in particular, he starts talking about wisdom. And of course, this is wisdom literature. So everything that he's writing about wisdom here, he starts talking about it, but he uses this. He says, wisdom crieth without, or wisdom here is crying out. And it says, she utters her voice in the streets. So wisdom is personified by a woman in this passage. The average person is probably not even going to see that and think about that. But you could go on through that, and she cries in the chief place of the concourse and the openings of the gates in the city. She utters her words, saying, how long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity, and the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge? I find that a little ironic. That particular passage, that's wisdom is personifying women, is calling out to those who would be maybe some of those who might be crying out that God is sexist even. And yet, wisdom itself is personified as a woman here. And you can go through this and you can see numerous other passages that kind of show the very same thing. But what you find is that Jesus himself elevated women. I mean, there were those women who worked with him, supported him, and helped him. They loved him, they fed him, they gave him shelter. They opened up their home to him as as a place to be and to always come and to be there with them. You have his good friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. It was often the occasion that he stayed with them, and they were,
Right.
They would help serve him and take care of his needs as he would come. But they weren't the only ones. That was kind of a normal thing. And so there are numerous women who are mentioned in the Bible as well who did. They helped. They supported the work. And we'll kind of get into some of those specifics here in just a moment. But they were right there. And so you have those women who were the last to leave the cross of Jesus and the first ones to the tomb. And the Bible elevates women. The fact that they're calling out that God is sexist probably gets into the place that it has to do with the role of women, obviously, and that's where the conversation generally will typically go. And I know that we'll probably go there in a moment.
Right.
But the idea that we need to be aware that God has elevated women, and at the same time, He is no respecter of persons.
Right.
And we'll kind of touch that in a moment.
What would you say, and I don't know that if you're a chess player or not, I'm not, but I believe that this will make sense. Bear with me. What would you say is the most important piece on the chessboard?
Well,
If you had to guess.
It's the most powerful one probably is the queen.
Okay.
She can go in every direction, right? It's interesting.
I would agree with that line of reasoning, that the piece that can go anywhere on the board and do anything. Some people might say the king, because you take the king, you've won.
Right.
But in truth, they're all, in my opinion,
very important.
Very important, because that pawn that
very first
sacrifices
pawn.
itself, that bishop that all of them play a role. And when you play the game of chess, and if you're very skilled at playing the game of chess, you will sacrifice a pawn if you know that it means I can still win the game. You're not saying in that moment, that pawn meant nothing to me.
Right.
You're saying, hey, play your role. You're going to help me win the battle. Same thing happens in war.
Sure.
You have the cavalry that comes in when they're needed, but you have foot soldiers, you have archers. Foot soldiers are foot soldiers not because that they're the worst armymen, but they maybe can't shoot a bow and arrow very well. Right. So you're not going to put them and say, hey, you be an archer and you see if you can help us with this battle. Everything has a role. That's just how life works. And when you look at that pawn, I've often equated myself to that mentality of, hey, I'm a pawn on a chessboard. I will play my role. I will do everything I can. And when it's time for me to be knocked off the board, I will gladly go over to the side and continue to watch the big boys play. And I have no problem with that. But I think that what you mentioned a moment ago is why I wanted to make that illustration of, we have that happen in war. We have it happen in games. There's so many things. I mean, you talk about football, for example. They say the most important position is the quarterback. Okay, take away the offensive line, see how he does. Take away the wide receiver, see how he plays. Just let the defense and the quarterback be on a field and see what happens. Well, you'd say, well, there's no contest. Oh, so then you admit it's not just a quarterback sport. Mm-hmm. But we have this tendency, because of the flashiest player or the player that seems to be the most important, of only talking about that individual, and the other people don't get their true due. And this last Super Bowl, the one that happened with the Chiefs and the Buccaneers, proved you got to have a really good, well-rounded team, or it's not even going to be a game.
Right.
And you can have one of the greatest quarterbacks on the field, and he can look terrible because he can't have any time to throw. And so everything has a role. But I think this comment of God is sexist really stems from the head of the wife mentality. We have had this mentality go through the world now where women are not allowed to be put in a place, if you will. I'm every woman. I am, who runs the world? I'm going to run the world. I'm a girl. I can run the world. I don't have to listen to anybody, is the mentality that's basically being screamed by everybody. But I think it's a misunderstanding. We've often talked about in preaching and teaching, context matters. Yeah. And when you rip something out of its context, it doesn't do anything good. There is an individual who tells a story about reading passages where, he read a passage that says, Judas went out and hung himself. And then he read another passage that says, do thou likewise. And then he read another passage, it's whatever you do, do quickly. Well, that's not the right way to study the Bible, because that man could take from that, well, God must want me to go hang myself. No, that's ridiculous. And we understand it with that. But for some reason, we can pull one phrase out of an entire part of the Bible and an entire part of the role of the family and say that makes God sexist. If you go to Ephesians chapter 5 and you look at this, you find the actual mindset of submitting to your own husbands. You're not just expected to submit to your husbands. Verse 22 says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Now, when it says he's the Savior, he's not talking about the husband there. He's talking about Christ. Right. And so we go on and he says, therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. But then we stop reading right there and someone can say, see, gotcha. God is sexist. He wants women to be put in their place. No, you need to keep reading, because we're told of how the husbands are to treat their wives. The Bible doesn't say, beginning in verse 25, now you let your wives know a thing or two about who's in charge. You make sure they understand that they are beneath you and that you are the head and that you always have to put them in their place. No, he says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy, without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. And so we have this picture that is given here of husbands and wives and Christ and the church. And we're told that a true relationship, a true biblical relationship, is to be handled as Christ and the church is handled. When we talk about the church, not many people that I know would disagree with the statement, Christ does have a right to say how the church should be run. Right. People will, at least on principle, believe that yes, because he's God, he has a right to say something. But when I change that phrase and say, I am subject to Christ, then there's some slight opposition. But take the phrase and just change it. Wives are subject to their husbands. In what way? In the way that they are expected to be led spiritually and handled in a way that the husband is the head of the wife, but that doesn't mean that the wife is put down here. Right. True leadership is more of a team. It's putting each other together and saying, this is what we're to do. But that husband has the right to say, no, I'm putting my foot down. We're not going to do that. We're not going down that path. That's not about what you're going to eat for dinner. It's not about where you're going to live. It's not about all these. It's more spiritual speaking. Right. Everything else is to be taken on a team basis. But if that wife starts to pull someone to the other side, that husband has to put his foot down. And why do we know that? Well, think of Solomon. Solomon allowed over 1,000 women to change his heart and pull him every which way. And I can't imagine how many times this conversation had to happen where Solomon was asked by one of his wives or a concubine, why don't you love me like you love this other person? Because you serve their God. Why won't you serve mine? Yeah. Because we're told that they drove the heart of Solomon away from God to their own gods, to this idolatry. And so we do know that women can affect, and the love that we have can change our mind. And so we're told we have to be strong. And we'll get into why in just a little while. I don't want to go too far ahead before the next question's asked, but I want it to be known that God is not a sexist when he says you have a role to play. Any more than it's, awful if you're in a play and you're not the lead. You have a role to play. I've done multiple plays in my lifetime. I've done plays where I've been the lead and I've had 400-something lines. I've done plays where I've been a background character that's just on for one scene, and I've done plays where I've worked the backstage. I haven't even been on the stage. And all of those, I played a vital role, even though I wasn't seen. I was recognized the same. Was I the lead? No, but that's not the role that I was assigned. Right. And that's the same with the church and the same with the home. But some people are starting to say, because of what God says about the home, and then because of what God says about the church, that women don't really have a place in God's kingdom. And they'll say, well, God must not love women. God must not care about women, because if he did, why couldn't they do X, Y, and Z? Why are they always told, no, you can't do this, you can't do that? So what would you do if someone said that women have no place whatsoever in the Lord's church?
Well, I would ask them to open up Romans chapter 16. There's, I think, at least 10 women, I think, that are listed there.
Right.
So nearly a dozen women are listed in that one chapter who worked with Paul, and Paul commended them for their works and told the church at Rome to commend them and to support them and to help them and to help see to their needs. But I mean, you go through the Bible and you talk about, women like Esther and Ruth, who's obviously in the lineage of David and ultimately the lineage of Christ, right? You think about Hannah, and Samuel's mother. You have Miriam. You have, she was, a leader, and leader of the women and so forth. You have Rahab and the work that she did, and you have all these women that are elevated in the works that they did. You have Elizabeth, when her New Testament's open, you were introduced to Elizabeth,
Right.
John the Baptist's, mother. And, then you have Mary, obviously the mother of Jesus, Priscilla, Dorcas. You have all these women listed here in Romans chapter 16. And so to say that women have no place in the church is foolish. And really, how many examples of women exalted in positions like that, how many examples do we need to show that God was, wanted these women to do these works and elevated them by listing them in Scripture in such a marvelous way, so that we could see their works. You think about Lydia, and she was a seller of purple. She had a business. She had her own household. She was fairly wealthy herself, obviously, and because she had a household, that kind of implies that. But when Paul comes on the scene and she's baptized, her and her household in Christ, and she constrains them to stay. She supports the work, and that's kind of the beginning of the church there as well. And the growing of the church is done, almost from her house. Very likely the case. And so, how many examples do we have to have
Right.
of women being elevated and to see that? But yes, because there are specific roles where there's male leadership in worship and in the organization of the church in that way, yes, then sometimes some will think, okay, well, women have no place, and that's unfortunate. And my wife, Cindy, and I, we've talked about this numerous times, and she's had opportunity to speak on Ladies' Days and at different things and lectureships and talk to women about, their roles and to encourage them, and young ladies especially, even at the Foundations program, to work with them and to encourage them, to know that they have a place in the church. How many works are done that are works of benevolence?
Right.
And, that I can help an individual, I can be benevolent, but sometimes women's hearts and their minds are so much better suited
Right.
For doing that work. They'll see something that I may never see for an individual. And sometimes it may be a family and their that family's particular needs, between that wife, maybe and the children or something like that, may be more pressing and something that I might not see, but a woman's going to pick up on very quickly. So, to say that the women have no role in the church, that's just foolish.
And I think part of that stems from, and I'll be honest, I'm a little frustrated at times when I see some of the mentality of the church, basically saying that women seem to only be good for a casserole and teaching a Bible class, right?
Right.
And that seems to be what we typically say is, and I'll be honest, a lot of the times I hear announcements made in certain churches when I visit somewhere, when I'm even in my own congregation, when I first started, before we really tried to correct this, was, hey, we need food delivered to this family that lost a loved one. And then I wouldn't hear anything else. And then we'd hear, we need Bible class teachers. But one of the things I love about the place where I'm preaching is our women are actually involved in our prison ministry. And what I mean by that is there are Bible correspondence course graders. And so they get a stack of courses that a prison inmate has taken. They go back with their answer key, they grade it, they work closely with myself and with the other minister, Ryan, and they let us know the problems or things that are going on. They let the person who works with the prison ministry specifically know, and we've got women that are fulfilling a role of evangelism without even preaching or teaching. That is perfectly fine for them to fill, and they never make a casserole dish, they never teach a Bible class, they simply do the work of a Christian. And like you mentioned, I think a lot of times that's where we get bogged down is we seem to have this mindset and idea that unless a woman is serving in the pulpit or behind the Lord's table or, teaching some grand seminar to all of the people to provide insight, therefore she has no value. Again, it goes back to the mindset of not every piece on a chessboard is equally valuable in what they're capable of doing, but they all play a very important role.
Right.
And as you get farther and farther back on that board, you get more and more important. It says nothing about the pawns. It says nothing about the bishops or the rooks or whatever. It simply says you have a role to play. But you think of the role of Esther. Esther alone is someone that, what would have happened if she didn't intervene?
Yeah.
What would have happened if Esther and Mordecai hadn't made that famous statement, perhaps you're here for such a time as this? Right. God doesn't want women to be a stepping stone. And you think about how God could have sent his son to this earth. He chose for him to be born of a woman. He chose for him to have a mother, to bestow one of the greatest blessings upon women.
Absolutely.
That she, Mary, would give birth to the Messiah. That is not a small thing. If God truly didn't value women, I don't think he would have done it that way.
Right.
If he truly didn't value the importance of women, I don't think he would have equated wisdom to a female perspective. I don't think he would have made so much time and care and effort to have entire books of the Bible dedicated to women's names. We have books of the Bible, Esther, Ruth, you've got all of these different books that talk about wisdom. I don't think he would have spent all of Proverbs 31 basically talking about the virtuous woman and saying this is what a good woman looks like, and she is not just a keeper at home. She is able to go out and she is able to provide and do things that make money. She has a role to play, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And it was Eve that was deceived, and Adam was deceived after that. And that was really why the husband was then placed into that role. Prior to that, you don't really find this mentality that you have this husband's up here, wife's down here. No, at this point, it's you're going to be subject to your husband because you were tempted, you did not overcome. He's now going to rule over you. It was a punishment, basically, that was given. But it's not to be seen as a punishment when it's done the right way. It is God has made a divine standard that we have to follow. And when we don't hold up to that standard, we're in trouble. But another problem that comes about this is kind of along the same vein about they have no place in the Lord's church is, again, people believe if you're not behind a pulpit, you're not valuable. Well, I'll get into that when I speak on this, but I want to ask you, what would you do if someone states that it is okay for women to lead in worship?
Well, I think you find in 1 Timothy chapter 2, obviously 1 Corinthians 14, there are some instructions given concerning women, and I think especially dealing with the problems at Corinth, it seems to come from a problematic point of view. That's how he's writing this. He's dealing with a problem. And there was a lot of confusion. Things were not done decently and in order. And part of that order were those women who, yes, had something to say, yet they were doing so out of order.
Right.
And not doing so decent. And if you remember that same letter also dealt with the authority as well, talking about man over the woman as Christ is over the church, and so Christ over the man, man over the woman. There was an order and an authority thing, and they were trying to sidestep that. They were taking off their head coverings as such, and which was in that culture especially a sign of humility and so forth. They were taking that off, and God says, you're out of place.
Right.
And in chapter 14, they were taking over those leadership roles in those public assemblies, and God said, this is not decent in order. And so inspired Paul to write and deal with that, obviously. 1 Timothy chapter 2, and just read a couple of verses here. We come to passages that sometimes only deal with how women are dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unfortunate because there's so much more talked about here. But he says in verse 8, he's talking about, I will, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, or doing so with holy hands, without wrath and without doubting. In like manner, also, without wrath and without doubting, women adorn themselves in modest apparel, shamefacedness, that humility and sobriety, that soundness of mind, not with broidered hair, pearls, costly array, but that which becometh women professing godliness with good works. So he's not saying don't do anything in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Women are going to be doing good works. I want the men leading. I want them the ones up front leading those prayers and doing so, obviously, with pure hearts,
Mm-hmm.
clear hands in that way, clean hands, holy hands is lifted up. And then he says, let the woman learn in silence there with all subjection. And again, that idea of submission, because Christ is over he's head of the man head of the woman. That order is given. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp or to take the authority over the man, but to be in silence. And then he says, why? Verse 13, Adam was first formed, and then Eve. There was an order to things. And you go back to Genesis and the creation of man and woman, the woman taken from the side of man, the rib of man,
Right.
to be a helper, to help sustain, to help support, to help him. And Adam was not deceived. So that wasn't the only reason. So there was an order.
Mm-hmm.
Adam was first formed, then Eve. And then in verse 14 it says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, charity, holiness with sobriety. So when he deals with this, there is a picture of humility that brings about that kind of modesty that is talked about. But also that is to be coupled together with good works in the Lord's church.
Right.
But he's very clear. I want men leading those prayers,
Right.
leading in those particular services. And so you go then and compare that to chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, and you see really the same thought pattern that is there. And so sometimes I'll ask the question, when you get to 1 Corinthians 14 in verse 33, where it talks about things should be done decently in order, or maybe verse 34, what is decent and orderly about what he's talking about? Contextually, he's talking about the way things were being done in those public assemblies.
Right.
And he did not want those women taking a leader role in those public assemblies. That was very clear in 1 Corinthians 14. Does that devalue a woman? Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the least. Each have their role.
Simple challenge that I would like anyone to complete and to, answer for me is to find me one reference in the New Testament that shows, allows, or gives way by principle for a woman to serve in any capacity in worship. You don't find any.
Sure.
And someone might say, well, what's wrong with passing out trays if she doesn't say the prayer? Okay, how far are we going to take that? Because eventually, you know what's going to be asked? Well, she's already up there. Why can't she just lead the prayer? We have to speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible is silent, and err on the side of caution, knowing what we can and cannot do. And not all men lead in worship. They're expected to, but not all men are wanting to do that. Yeah. So not everybody can lead in that capacity. God made the best compliment to women when he said that she would be a helpmeet to Adam.